Grazie, buonasera.
Thank you and good evening. I would like to start from the last words of Juan, whom I thank very much. And I'd like to add something else. It's not that we can, we must be activists. And I'm not just saying on behalf of Amnesty International, because right now we are not particularly interested in gaining new followers. What we care about is for people to become political activists in their lives. I hope that you will take my words as a reflection on what we can all do in our own fields with our peculiarities, our skills, and our will to change things. I can make the example of Amnesty International. It is a movement that, after 61 years, has started realizing the limitations of its being a London-based movement. If you know English, you know that when you say that something is based somewhere, it doesn't just mean it is headquartered there. It means that it absorbs, sometimes involuntarily, the ethics, the culture of that place, and therefore its history as well, with its pros and cons. Amnesty International is an interesting movement of activists because it started with a very simple act, writing a letter. However, at an historical time when the idea that letters could be written to the same address from many different places in the world was quite difficult. I wouldn't say it was revolutionary, but it was difficult. It was revolutionary when the letters became in the thousands. But the original idea was that at that time something was unclear. Public opinion was taking the Declaration of Human Rights, it was taking it seriously. In 61, the Universal Declaration was little more than a piece of paper and a text expressing good hopes. It didn't even have legal value at the international level. We had to wait until 66 and then 76 with the implementation of the New York agreements to make this declaration a little bit more serious. But back in 1961, an article was published. It was about two young people who had celebrated the freeing of the colonies, and they cheered and they drank to this. Now, the idea that someone even cared about these two young people who had been arrested and forgotten by the regime, now thinking that people would care about this fact was unbelievable. But really, this is exactly what happened. Many, many people thought this was an important event. So in 1961, even though there were no instruments to communicate easily in the world, but still it was possible to attract interest on a traumatic event using a very simple instrument, writing a letter. Those were complicated years in terms of communications, but the era of rights, the so-called era of rights, had just begun. I know I might sound boring because I'm starting from the 60s, but if you bear with me and if you are a little patient, I will explain why it is so important to start from the 60s. After 48, for the first time, the issue of what human rights are is solved. This is a discussion involving people in different parts in the world. And the discussion had been going on for centuries. And in 48, finally, we had a piece of paper that said, these are human rights, and everybody enjoys these rights. From 48 onwards, there is a moment which I think ended in 2001, in fact, on September 11th, 2001. But over these years, we somehow try to make progress in the field of human rights. Philosophically, the problem was solved. Politically, the issue was being discussed. As of 2011, we said, okay, these are human rights. Everybody enjoys them. How can we defend them? How can we protect them? Now, in 61, Amnesty International started when everybody sent letters to prisons in the world to make sure that prisoners of conscience would be freed. So gradually, civil society got organized. Things continued until one event, namely 1998, when in Rome, the International Crime Court was created. For the first time, it questions even the fact that there is a freedom of action without any control, with the exception of the right to war, by countries during armed conflicts. So for the first time, before an armed conflict, because after a war you have the court of winners, well, that's when they defined what genocide is, what the crime against humanity is, etc. That is the highest point that was reached, and the International Crime Court was created because public opinion was demanding more and more. The success of treaties are never successes of governments. Normally, governments don't want to change things and limit themselves. When human beings have an opportunity, we tend to exploit it. It's very difficult for human beings to limit ourselves. In the history of mankind, limitations have always come from higher coercive forces. And stronger than a tyrant can only be a united people. So that was the highest peak. Many countries were not happy, though. The Rome Charter was not welcomed warmly by all governments in the world. In 2001, with September 11th, those who were not particularly interested in this process to improve human rights in the world, well, they finally find the winning card. War on terror. There's no better enemy. It's not well defined. It can be everywhere. And war on terror means that you can continue doing what you did before, business as usual, and also you can identify some areas and some enemies that are unbelievably in places with lots of raw materials. This sort of ends the era of rights. At first, we didn't perceive it. We have people protesting, people taking the streets and criticizing armed intervention in Iraq. So we saw many demonstrations, but gradually things start to change. As Amnesty International, we don't agree when people say we're taking steps backwards. We would take steps backwards if we erased our milestones, but milestones cannot be erased. You can bury them, but they're still there. What we are doing now is that we're doing something more. We're not taking the best and moving forwards, but what we're doing is we're saying that human rights, democracy have failed, and therefore we're no longer interested. Governors like Putin are saying this explicitly. Others are saying it in a more subtle way. But as a matter of fact, what we are hearing is that what happened from 48 onwards was wrong, limited, ethnocentric. That's true, but the problem was the implementation and not the universal principles. if those universal principles had been applied correctly, then probably we would live in a better world with still some room for improvement. So what we are seeing is that we are getting out of the time of rights. We are exiting the political dimension of the issue. We're not going back to philosophy. We are abandoning the discourse, and we are embracing a much older discourse, namely the authoritative approach. So the reason why today it's not a matter of being able to be activists. And so back to what Eleanor Roosevelt said, that activism is created in small places. Who cares? Activism must emerge from small and big places. We are witnessing an exiting this era. It's much worse than taking steps backwards. Once we close a door, that door will be destroyed. We won't be able to open it again with the addition of climate injustice. So right now we must be activists, and we must be activists in a way that hasn't been designed yet. I don't want to generalize, because I'm a man, I'm white and cisgender, etc. My normality is a certain type of normality. So I am telling you Amnesty's idea, a movement that, with all its issues and limitations, is questioning itself. It has a history, despite all its limitations, and it's questioning itself. Now, Amnesty International has tried to question itself on several points. First of all, it has realized, and you will see it if we look at our global campaign, I Protect Protests, and this once again is proving that we're exiting the time of rights. We have to protect protesting. And the right to protest is in the preamble to the declaration. The preamble to the Declaration of Human Rights says at one point that the signing countries recognize the fact that if human rights are not respected, the human being has no other choice but to rebel against oppression. It's quite meaningful that this sentence is not contained in a right, but it is in the preamble, because this means that once you are in that situation, you're outside the rights, the realm of rights. In 48, what is being said is this is a precondition. You have to respect human rights, because otherwise human beings must revolt and rebel. Many theorists say that the Human Declaration does not safeguard the right to rebel, but it accepts it. It cannot be a right, because if a country respects human rights and it is democratic, there's no rebellion, there's just a free expression of your ideas. Now, Amnesty has launched a campaign, and we've called it I Protect Protests. And that means that you are not protecting free expression, you are protecting those who are rebelling. And statistically, we are already seeing that the democracy index has been worsening for years, which means that all countries are going towards this new paradigm, towards authoritarian regimes. We are physically moving away from human rights. The only thing I'm asking you, I might sound authoritative, but never talk about going back. The problem is that we're going beyond, we're not just going back. Because otherwise you just have people talking about good old times and the El Dorado. Who cares about looking back at the past? It's not a matter of going back. It's better to look at the future, both as activists and as people. Also because we can't go back to the future, but it would be nice to get to our future. So the issue is we need to focus on the fact that we are in this situation now. But 10 million activists in 76 national headquarters, this is a lot, but 75% of the representatives coming to our global meetings are not white necessarily, but they all have a degree. And because this does not match the world percentage, you don't have 75% of the people in the world with a bachelor degree, that means we are not representative. Also, we are Eurocentric in our history as Amnesty International, which means that sometimes we are Eurocentric in our way of thinking. We published some reports that note that our organization often has inequivocably racist approaches. Is it good that a movement for human rights is racist? Of course not. But this means that there are some faults, but also that the value system is changing. Things that were accepted in the past are no longer acceptable. And so organizations are not need to evolve over time. We're not the same as we were in 61, and so we need to evolve with the values changing. Values change because the world changes, but also because more and more people are involved in our fight. It's a long process. My invitation to you and to people who want to become activists with Amnesty or anyone else is please do not perceive these defects, these faults, these shortcomings as something that cannot be eliminated and changed. Let's grow together. Let's talk to each other. History is made of people who progressively understood that things could be changed. I've been in Amnesty International for 20 years. I am certainly not the same person who joined the movement in 2003. And Amnesty has changed as well. Together, we need to stand together. And it is beautiful to be activists as individuals, but there is an advantage in being part of an organization, whether small or big. Because you need to be accountable, because you are representing a wider entity, a bigger body, and therefore the ethics, the morals of that group cannot match our individual moral. Being an individual activist frees us from a lot of problems. I know many activists, I don't agree with all of them, but they force me to be up to scratch to the name I'm representing. If you're by yourself, this is something that you miss. And the risk is that at one point, we become really ethnocentric. We think that our ethics should be the ethics of the world. That's quite dangerous, really. It becomes an ethnocentric approach. So I hope that what we will do in the next few years is let's mix up. Let's mix together. Thank you very much.